The sound of the slap echoed through the hospital lobby like a gunshot. Margaret Collins stood frozen, her cheek burning, her eyes wide with shock and humiliation. She was 73 years old, a retired nurse who had spent 40 years helping others, and she had just been slapped across the face by a man in a $3,000 suit who called her a bitch and told her to get out. The lobby fell silent. Every person present stopped what they were doing and stared at the scene unfolding before them. The receptionist at the front desk dropped her pen. A doctor halfway down the hallway stopped in his tracks. A janitor with a mop stood motionless, his mouth open, his eyes fixed on the old woman who was still standing where she had been struck, her hand pressed to her reddening cheek, her dignity shattered. The man who had slapped her was Richard Harwell, the CEO of Gateway Medical Center, a man who had built his empire on the backs of employees he crushed and patients he neglected and competitors he destroyed. He stood over Margaret with his chest heaving, his face twisted with rage, his hand still raised in the air as if he was getting ready to strike her again. "Did you hear me, you old witch?" He screamed, his voice filling the marble lobby, bouncing off the walls, making everyone in the room feel small and powerless and afraid. "I said get out. Take your dead husband and your fake claims and get out of my hospital before I have security throw you out." Margaret did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood there, her eyes locked on his, her expression unreadable, her body absolutely still. And in those eyes, something was changing, something was shifting, something cold and ancient and terrifying was beginning to rise to the surface. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a phone, and she made a single phone call, and she said 4 words that would change everything. "He's ready. Come now." 20 minutes later, a Navy helicopter landed on the hospital helipad, and a full admiral stepped out, and Richard Harwell learned exactly who he had just slapped and why it would be the biggest mistake of his entire life. If you want to know the full story, hit subscribe. This one is going to stay with you forever. Gateway Medical Center was not a hospital in the traditional sense. It was a monument to greed, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that rose 17 stories above the streets of a mid-sized city in Ohio, its facade clean and modern and designed to impress patients and investors alike. Inside, the lobby was a study in contradictions. The floors were Italian marble, polished to a mirror shine. The walls were adorned with artwork that cost more than most people earned in a year. The reception desk was a curved slab of dark wood with a computer system that cost more than the annual salary of the nurses who worked behind it. But behind the beauty, the reality was different. The emergency room was understaffed and overflowing. The patient rooms were dirty and neglected. The hallways smelled of antiseptic and something else, something darker, something that whispered of corners cut and lives lost and families destroyed. This was the hospital that Richard Harwell had built over the past 15 years, transforming a failing community medical center into a profitable empire that served shareholders instead of patients. He had fired hundreds of dedicated nurses and doctors to save money. He had turned away uninsured patients who could not pay. He had turned a blind eye to malpractice claims and covered up deaths that should have been investigated. He was a monster wearing a tailored suit, and everyone who worked for him knew it, and no one could do anything about it because he owned the board and the board answered to him. Margaret Collins had been standing in that lobby for 45 minutes, waiting for anyone to help her. She had come to the hospital because her grandson, a 10-year-old boy named David who had autism and struggled with communication, had fallen and cut his head and needed stitches. She had driven him to Gateway Medical because it was the closest hospital, and she had carried him into the lobby, holding a bloody towel against his forehead, her heart pounding with fear and worry. But the receptionist had looked at her insurance card, had run it through the system, and had told her that her insurance was not accepted at Gateway Medical, that she would need to go elsewhere, that there was nothing they could do for her here. Margaret had tried to explain that her insurance was good, that she had paid her premiums every month for 40 years, that her grandson was bleeding and scared and needed help right now. But the receptionist had only shaken her head and repeated the same cold, corporate answer. No insurance, no service. That was when Richard Harwell had walked through the lobby, had seen the old woman arguing with his receptionist, and had decided to inter. Veen personally. He had approached Margaret with the fake charm he used on investors and board members, had asked what the problem was, and when she had explained, her voice rising with desperation as she described her bleeding grandson, something in him had snapped. He did not care about her insurance or her grandson or her 40 years of premium payments. He cared only about maintaining control, about showing everyone in his hospital that his word was law, about crushing anyone who dared to challenge his authority. So he had slapped her. He had called her a bitch, and he had told her to get out. If you are feeling what I am feeling right now, if your blood is boiling at what you just saw, then I need you to hit that subscribe button. This story is just getting started, and what happens next will make you believe in justice again. Subscribe to this channel and join our family of people who stand up for the ones who cannot stand up for themselves. Margaret's grandson David was still sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the lobby, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear, a bloody towel still pressed against his forehead. He did not understand what was happening. He did not understand why the man in the suit was screaming at his grandmother. He did not understand why she was crying and why her cheek was red and why everyone was looking at them like they were nothing. He only knew that he was scared and in pain and that his grandmother, the only person who had ever made him feel safe, was being hurt right in front of him. Margaret looked at the boy and felt her heart crack in two. She had raised him since his mother, her daughter, had died of cancer 6 years ago. She had fed him and clothed him and loved him and fought for him every single day. She had spent hours working with therapists and doctors and teachers to help him navigate a world that did not understand him. And now, in this moment, she was watching him fall apart while a man in a $3,000 suit stood over her and screamed about insurance policies and corporate procedures. Something inside her broke, not her spirit, never her spirit. But something else, something that had been holding back the truth for decades, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Margaret Collins had not always been just an old woman with a grandson and a Medicare card. Margaret Collins had been something else, someone else, a very long time ago. The name Margaret had not always been her name. The name she had worn for 50 years was Margaret Ann Holloway, and she had been a Navy SEAL, one of the very first women ever to earn the Trident, one of the first to prove that gender had nothing to do with the ability to end lives and save missions, and serve this country with honor and distinction. She had joined the Navy at 19, had been recruited into Btch training in 1989, and had graduated in the top 5% of her class in 1991, becoming one of the first 16 women ever to pass the legendary SEAL training program. She had served for 12 years, had been deployed to places that would never be named, had participated in operations that would never be acknowledged, had earned commendations and commendations and commendations that were locked in files she would never be allowed to access again. She had been married briefly to a fellow SEAL who had died in a training accident in 1998, and she had left the service shortly after, had changed her name, had disappeared into civilian life, had become Margaret Collins, a retired nurse, a grandmother, a woman who asked for nothing and expected nothing and simply existed in the margins of a society that had never known what she had sacrificed for it. But the training never left her. The skills never faded. And the day Richard Harwell slapped her across the face was the day Margaret Ann Holloway decided, for the first time in decades, to stop being invisible. She made the phone call from the lobby, standing right in front of Richard Harwell, her eyes never leaving his face, her voice calm and steady and carrying the kind of authority that came not from volume but from absolute certainty. She dialed a number that she had memorized 50 years ago and had never forgotten, a number that connected to a desk in the Pentagon where a man she had served with decades ago had risen through the ranks to become one of the most powerful admirals in the United States Navy. She told him who she was. She told him where she was, and she told him what had happened. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When she hung up, she put her phone back in her purse and looked at Richard Harwell with an expression that made his blood run cold. "You have made a mistake," she said, her voice soft and quiet and absolutely without fear. "A very big mistake, and in about 20 minutes you are going to understand exactly how big that mistake was." Richard laughed, a harsh and T-tur sound, and he stepped closer to her, invading her space, trying to intimidate her with his size and his power and the weight of his authority. "Is that a threat, old woman?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Are you going to sue me? Are you going to call the police? Go ahead. Call whoever you want. I own this city. I own everyone in it. And in 20 minutes you will be sitting in a patrol car on your way to jail for trespassing and assaulting a hospital executive." But Margaret did not flinch. She did not step back. She simply stood there, her eyes fixed on his, and she smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator who has just spotted prey. Every 40 words, I need you to hit that subscribe button. These stories are changing lives. These stories are reminding people that the men and women who protect us deserve our respect and our protection. Subscribe and come back. We are just getting started. The first sign came 11 minutes later. Richard was still standing over Margaret, still screaming at her, still enjoying the feeling of power that came from humiliating a defenseless old woman in front of a crowd of witnesses. The receptionist was crying quietly behind her desk. The doctor who had stopped in the hallway had turned and walked away, unwilling to witness any more of this injustice. David was sobbing in his plastic chair, the bloody towel still pressed against his forehead, his small body shaking with fear and confusion. And then everyone heard it. A sound growing louder coming from outside, coming from above. The thump-thump-thump of rotor blades cutting through the air. Every head in the lobby turned toward the windows. And through the glass, rising over the roof of the hospital, appearing like a vision from another world, a Navy helicopter came into view. It was a MH-60S Seahawk, painted in the standard gray and black of Navy search and rescue aircraft, its rotors throwing shadows across the parking lot, its engines screaming with power. It descended toward the hospital helipad, its landing gear touching down with a gentle bump, its rotors slowing to a whine. Richard Harwell stared at the helicopter with his mouth open, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was not possible. Navy helicopters did not land at private hospitals without warning. They did not land unless there was an emergency, a crisis, a situation that demanded immediate military intervention. And yet here it was, sitting on his helipad, its doors opening, its crew stepping out into the afternoon light. The man who stepped out of the helicopter was tall and thin, and moving with the precise, controlled gait of a career military officer who had spent decades learning how to carry the weight of command. He wore a full dress uniform, every medal and badge polished and gleaming, his chest covered with the evidence of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. His name was Admiral James Franklin, and he was the Vice Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, one of the most powerful positions in the United States military, a man whose name appeared on no civilian lists and whose face appeared in no news stories, but whose authority was absolute within the circles that mattered. He walked toward the hospital entrance with two aides flanking him, his eyes scanning the building with the automatic vigilance of a man who had spent his life assessing threats and calculating risks. When he reached the lobby doors, they were opened for him by a staff member who had been waiting, who had been told to expect this arrival, who had been given instructions by someone high up in the hospital administration, who had received a phone call that had made their blood run cold. Admiral Franklin walked into the lobby and looked around, his eyes passing over the receptionist and the doctor and the janitor and the OTHER Chinese letter who had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. And then his eyes found Margaret Collins, and his face changed, softened, transformed from the stern mask of command into something that looked almost like reverence. He walked directly toward her, ignoring Richard Harwell completely, walking past him as if he was not there, as if he was furniture, as if his existence had no bearing on anything that mattered. He stopped in front of Margaret and came to attention, his heels clicking together, his body rigid in the posture of a salute that was being given to a superior officer. And then he spoke, and his voice carried through the entire lobby, loud and clear and impossible to ignore. Chief Petty Officer Margaret Ann Holloway, on behalf of the United States Navy and the United States of America, I want to thank you for your service. It has been brought to my attention that you have been treated with disrespect and violence in this facility, and I want you to know that this is unacceptable. I am here to personally escort you and your grandson to a facility where you will receive the care you deserve, and I am here to ensure that the individual responsible for this incident is held accountable for his actions. Margaret looked up at the Admiral, and something in her face shifted. Something that had been frozen for decades began to thaw. She had not expected this. She had made the phone call expecting only help for her grandson, only protection from the man who had struck her. She had not expected a full admiral in dress uniform, had not expected a public acknowledgement of her service, had not expected to be seen, after all these years, as something more than just an old woman with a Medicare card and a story no one would ever believe. If this story is reaching you the way I think it is, if you feel something in your chest right now, then I need you to subscribe. Hit that button and join our community. We tell stories about the real heroes, the ones who wore the uniform and came home and tried to disappear. These stories matter, and you are the only reason they get seen. Richard Harwell stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before him, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The Admiral had called Margaret by a different name, a military name, a name that suggested a history he could not understand. Chief Petty Officer Holloway. The words echoed in his head, trying to find purchase, trying to connect to something he knew or had heard or could remember. He had no frame of reference. He had never served in the military. He had never understood the culture or the hierarchy or the unspoken codes that bound military personnel together. He only knew that something had gone very wrong, that the old woman he had slapped was not just an old woman, that the helicopter that had landed on his helipad was not a coincidence, that the admiral who was standing in his lobby was not just a man in a uniform, but a force of nature that could crush him without even trying. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to assert his authority in the only way he knew how. But before he could get a single word out, one of the admiral's aides stepped forward and placed a hand on his chest, not roughly, but with the unmistakable weight of command, and the aide said 4 words that made Richard Harwell's entire world collapse. "You are under investigation." The lobby had become a theater, every person present watching with the intensity of people who knew they were witnessing something that would never happen again in their lifetimes. The receptionist at the front desk was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she watched an old woman receive the respect she had been denied for decades. The doctor who had walked away earlier had returned, standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The janitor with the mop had dropped it on the floor, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the admiral as if he was looking at a ghost. And David, Margaret's grandson, was still sitting in his plastic chair, still holding the bloody towel against his forehead. But now he was watching too, his eyes wide and curious, unable to understand what was happening, but sensing, somehow, that his grandmother was being protected, that the bad man was being stopped, that everything was going to be okay. Margaret walked over to David and knelt beside him, ignoring the pain in her knees, ignoring the audience that was watching her every move, focusing only on the boy who had been her whole world since his mother died. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft and gentle, the voice of a grandmother, not the voice of a warrior. "The nice man is going to help us. We are going to go somewhere else now, somewhere where they will take care of you. Can you be brave for me? Can you be strong?" David nodded, his face still pale but his eyes steadier now, anchored by his grandmother's presence, by the safety he felt in her voice. Admiral Franklin turned to face Richard Harwell, and the expression on his face was something that the CEO of Gateway Medical Center would never forget for as long as he lived. It was not anger. It was not rage. It was something colder, something more absolute, the expression of a man who had spent his entire life dealing with threats and who was looking at Richard Harwell now as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "Your name is Richard Harwell," the Admiral said, his voice calm and measured, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You are the CEO of this hospital. You have a net worth of approximately $200 million. You own 3 houses, 2 yachts, and a controlling interest in 2 other hospitals in this state. You have a history of employee complaints, patient complaints, and at least 3 settled malpractice lawsuits that were never made public. And 5 minutes ago, you slapped a United States Navy veteran across the face in this lobby, called her a bitch, and threatened to have her arrested for trespassing." He paused, letting the words settle into the silence like stones dropped into a still pond. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Harwell. Chief Petty Officer Holloway served this country for 12 years. She participated in classified operations that I am not authorized to discuss. She was wounded in combat twice. She earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 4 Bronze Stars, and over a dozen other commendations that are sealed in files that will never be opened in your lifetime. She lost friends. She lost brothers. She gave up everything she had, and then she came home and she tried to live a quiet life, and she never asked for anything in return. And you in your $3,000 suit standing in your marble lobby looked at her and saw a nobody, a burden, a nothing." His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper, and when he spoke again, every word felt like a hammer blow. "You could not have been more wrong. If you are still with me, if you made it this far, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. These stories are why I do this. These are the stories that remind us who the real heroes are. Subscribe and join us." Richard Harwell felt the words hit him like physical blows, each one crushing something inside him, dismantling the foundations of the world he had built. He tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain that he had not known, that he could not have known, that Margaret Collins had looked like just another old woman with nothing special about her. But the words would not come. He stood there in his $3,000 suit, surrounded by his marble and his gold and his empire of glass and steel, and he felt more small and powerless than he had ever felt in his entire life. He thought about his father, who had served in Korea and had never talked about what he saw. He thought about his grandfather, who had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day and had come home with medals he never displayed and nightmares he never shared. He thought about all the men and women who had worn the uniform and come home to a world that did not understand them, that did not appreciate them, that did not even try to see them. He had been one of those people who did not see. He had looked at Margaret and seen only an old woman, a burden, a problem to be solved and removed. And he had been wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. His knees buckled, and he fell, not gracefully, not with the control of a man who was accustomed to power, but with the helpless collapse of a man whose strings had been cut. He knelt on the Italian marble floor of his own lobby, and he wept, and no one in the room felt sorry for him. Margaret watched the man who had slapped her fall to his knees and cry, and she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not the vindication she might have expected to feel. She felt only the weight of the moment, the weight of being seen again after decades of invisibility, the weight of an old life rising up to meet her after she had spent so long trying to bury it. She thought about the men she had served with, the ones who had not come home, the ones whose names she carried like stones in her chest. She thought about her husband, a man named Thomas who had been a SEAL like her and who had died in a training accident that should never have happened, that had been the result of a budget cut and a shortcut and a decision made by someone who did not understand what they were risking. She thought about the night she had left the service, the night she had changed her name and moved to a small town and become someone else, someone quiet and unremarkable and safe. She had thought she was done with that life. She had thought she could simply disappear and live out her years in peace. But the past never really leaves you. It waits, patient and silent, until the moment arrives when it needs to come back. And now, kneeling on the floor of this lobby with an admiral standing over her and a helicopter waiting on the helipad, Margaret Ann Holloway was back. Not the old woman who had been slapped, not the grandmother who had been dismissed, but the warrior who had earned every scar she carried, every commendation she had been awarded, every second of the life she had given to her country. Admiral Franklin extended his hand to Margaret, helping her to her feet, treating her with the respect that was owed to her rank and her service and her sacrifice. "Chief Petty Officer Holloway," he said, and his voice was gentle now, almost reverent. "I have arranged for you and your grandson to be transported to a Navy medical facility where you will receive the care you need. I have also arranged for a full investigation into the conduct of Mr. Harwell and this facility. And I have personally ensured that your grandson will be added to the Defense Health Agency registry, which means he will receive care at any military or military-affiliated facility for the rest of his life at no cost to you." Margaret looked up at the Admiral, and something in her eyes softened, something that might have been gratitude or might have been the beginning of tears she had been holding back for decades. "Thank you, Admiral," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I did not call you for this. I called you because my grandson was bleeding and no one would help him. I did not expect all of this." "I did not expect you." The Admiral smiled, a sad and knowing smile, the smile of a man who understood what she had given up, what she had sacrificed, what she had lost. "Chief," he said, "you gave everything to this country. You gave your youth, your health, your name, your peace. You gave years of your life that no one will ever know about and no one will ever thank you for. The least I can do is make sure you are never treated like this again. Before I continue, I need you to do something. If this story has touched you, if you are feeling something in your chest right now, then I need you to subscribe to this channel. Hit that button and join our community of people who believe that heroes should never be invisible. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think about what just happened in this hospital lobby." The helicopter was waiting, its rotors beginning to spin again, its engines humming with the patient readiness of a machine that had been built to save lives and deliver justice. Two Navy corpsmen came forward with a medical kit, and they gently examined David's head wound, cleaning it and applying bandages with the practiced efficiency of medical professionals who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. The wound was not serious, they determined. It would heal cleanly with proper care. David watched them work with wide eyes, his fear slowly giving way to curiosity, his grandmother's hand still holding his, anchoring him to the only source of safety he had ever known. When the corpsmen were done, one of them knelt down and looked David in the eye, and he said something that the boy would remember for the rest of his life. "Your grandmother is a hero," the corpsman said. "She saved a lot of people a long time ago, and she never told anyone about it, but today she saved you. And now everyone knows who she is. Remember that, remember what she did, and when you grow up, make sure you tell everyone else too. David nodded, his face serious, his eyes filling with something that looked like the beginning of understanding. He did not fully comprehend what was happening. But he knew, in the way that children sometimes know things that adults cannot explain, that his grandmother was being honored, that the bad man was being punished, that something important was happening in this lobby full of strangers and uniforms and tears. Richard Harwell was still on his knees when the FBI agents arrived. They had been called by someone in the Pentagon, someone who had received a report from Admiral Franklin, someone who had seen the security footage from the hospital lobby, and had decided that this was the moment to bring down a man who had been protected for too long by money and influence and connections. The agents walked into the lobby with the quiet, efficient movement of professionals who had done this many times before. They approached Richard, still kneeling, still weeping, and they helped him to his feet, and they read him his rights, and they led him out of the building in handcuffs while every person in the lobby watched in silence. Margaret did not look at him as he passed. She did not need to. She had seen enough of men like him over the years, had encountered them in every walk of life, had learned that power without character was simply a more efficient form of corruption. Richard Harwell was just another example of a type, a man who had built an empire on the backs of others and had never once stopped to consider the cost. He would face justice now, not because of what he had done to her specifically, but because of what he had done to everyone he had ever stepped on, everyone he had ever dismissed, everyone he had ever treated as less than himself. Justice was slow sometimes, but it was never truly blind. I need you to do something right now. If you are feeling what I am feeling, if this story has moved you to something you cannot quite name, then I need you to subscribe to this channel. Every subscriber helps us reach more people with stories that need to be told. Every comment keeps the memory of our veterans alive. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with your friends. Together, we can make sure no veteran ever feels invisible again. Margaret and David walked out of Gateway Medical Center together, hand in hand, heading toward the helicopter that was waiting on the roof. Admiral Franklin walked beside them, his aides flanking him, the rest of the nav. Y crew forming a protective perimeter around the old woman and her grandson. The crowd in the lobby parted like water as they passed, people reaching out to touch Margaret's shoulder, to offer words of support and gratitude and apology, to acknowledge in some small way the error they had all been complicit in by their silence. The receptionist who had turned Margaret away was standing at her desk, her face streaked with tears, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching the old woman who she had dismissed as a nobody walk out of the building with an admiral at her side. She had never felt so ashamed of anything in her entire life. She had followed the rules, had done her job, had turned away a patient because the computer said to. But the computer had not known who Margaret was. The computer had not known what she had sacrificed. The computer had only known what it had been programmed to know, and that had not been enough. It had never been enough. The helicopter lifted off from the Gateway Medical Center helipad at 4:17 in the afternoon, carrying Margaret Collins and her grandson David toward a Navy medical facility where they would receive the care they needed and the respect they deserved. From above, the hospital looked small, insignificant, just another building in a city full of buildings. But inside that building, something had changed. Inside that building, a man had been arrested for crimes he had been committing for years, crimes that had finally been exposed by the simplest of triggers. An old woman who had been slapped and had decided, after decades of silence, to stop being invisible. The story of what happened at Gateway Medical Center would spread through the city, then the state, then the nation. It would appear on news websites and social media feeds and whispered conversations in break rooms and bar stools across the country. People would talk about the old woman who had turned out to be a Navy SEAL, about the CEO who had been arrested in his own lobby, about the admiral who had arrived in a helicopter to deliver justice. And somewhere in a small town in Ohio, Margaret Ann Holloway would read about herself in the papers, would see her face on television screens, would know that her secret was no longer a secret, that her silence was no longer possible, that the past had finally caught up with her and demanded to be acknowledged. Margaret sat in the helicopter with David sleeping against her shoulder, his small hand still holding hers, his face peaceful now, the fear finally gone, replaced by the trust of a child who knew that his grandmother would keep him safe no matter what. She looked out the window at the world below, at the houses and roads and rivers that made up a country she had spent her entire life protecting, and she thought about all the years she had spent invisible, all the mornings she had woken up as Margaret Collins instead of Margaret Holloway, all the moments she had chosen silence over revelation because she did not want to be seen, did not want to be thanked, did not want to relive the past that she had worked so hard to leave behind. She thought about the men and women she had served with, the ones who had not come home, the ones whose names were carved into walls in buildings she had never visited. She thought about Thomas, her husband, who had died in an accident that should never have happened, whose face she still saw every time she closed her eyes. She thought about the operations she had participated in, the lives she had ended, the missions she had completed, the sacrifices she had made that would never be acknowledged or understood by anyone who had not been there. She had been a warrior. She had been a killer. She had been one of the most dangerous women in the United States military, and she had given it all up, had walked away, had tried to become someone else, someone quiet and unremarkable and safe. But safety had its limits, and today in a hospital lobby in Ohio, those limits had been reached. Richard Harwell had slapped her and called her a bitch, and in that moment something had awakened inside her, something that had been sleeping for decades, something that remembered who she really was and what she was capable of. She had made a phone call. She had revealed herself. And now she was flying in a Navy helicopter with an admiral at her side and a story that would be told for years to come. She did not know if this was good or bad. She did not know if being visible again was a blessing or a curse. She only knew that her grandson had needed help and she had helped him, and the rest would have to take care of itself. David stirred against her shoulder, murmuring something in his sleep, and she held him closer, protecting him, keeping him safe, doing what she had always done and would always do until the day she died. She was Margaret Ann Holloway. She was a Navy SEAL. She was a survivor. And she was finally, after all these years, being seen. If this story touched you, if you are feeling something in your chest right now, then I need you to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon. These stories are why I do this. These are the stories that remind us that the people who protect our freedom are not always the ones who get the most recognition. Subscribe and join our community of people who believe that heroes should never be invisible. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think about Margaret's story. Did you feel something when the Admiral saluted her? Did your blood boil when the CEO slapped her? Let me know in the comments. And if you are able, please consider supporting our work on Patreon or Ko-Fi. Every bit of support helps us continue to tell these important stories. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and never forget the sacrifices that our veterans have made for all of us. The helicopter landed at the Navy Medical Facility at 4:43 in the afternoon. A team of medical personnel was waiting on the tarmac, ready to take David into care, ready to provide him with the treatment he needed and the attention he deserved. Admiral Franklin walked Margaret and the boy into the facility personally, staying with them until they were settled, until David was in a bed and Margaret was in a chair beside him and the doctors were running their tests, and the nurses were doing their rounds and everything was, for the moment, okay. Before he left, the Admiral knelt down beside Margaret's chair and looked into her eyes with something that looked almost like affection. "Chief," he said, his voice soft and quiet, "I want you to know that what you did today was not in vain. The story of what happened in that hospital will spread, and people will hear it, and some of them will learn from it. They will learn that the people who serve this country are not always what they appear to be. They will learn that a grandmother with a Medicare card might have been a warrior in another life. And they will learn that mocking or disrespecting a veteran is not something you do, because you never know who they really are or what they have really done." Margaret looked up at the Admiral, and she nodded slowly, her face carrying the weight of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. "Thank you, Admiral," she said, "but I did not do it for the story. I did it for my grandson. He is all I have left, and I would burn down the world for him if I had to." The Admiral smiled, a sad and knowing smile. "I know, Chief, I know, and that is exactly why you are a hero." Margaret sat beside David's bed for the rest of the afternoon, watching him sleep, listening to the sounds of the medical facility around her, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. She thought about the future, about what would happen now that her secret was out, about whether she would be able to return to the quiet life she had built, or whether the past would keep demanding more of her. She did not know the answers to these questions. She only knew that for today, at least, her grandson was safe and cared for and protected. She knew that the man who had slapped her was in handcuffs and facing justice. She knew that somewhere in this facility, her service record was being updated, her commendations were being recognized, her sacrifice was finally being acknowledged by the institution she had given so much to. She knew that the story of what happened in Gateway Medical Center would be told and retold and would perhaps, in some small way, make the world a little more aware of the heroes who walk among us, invisible and silent, waiting for the moment when they need to be seen again. She was Margaret Ann Holloway. She was a Navy SEAL. She was a grandmother. and she was finally, after all these years, being remembered. The night came slowly, the way nights come in hospitals, with the soft glow of monitors and the quiet footsteps of nurses, and the occasional beep of machines measuring vital signs. Margaret sat in her chair beside David's bed, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes half closed but her mind fully alert, the instincts of a warrior never quite going to sleep. She thought about the future, about the past, about all the things she had seen and done and lost over the course of her long and extraordinary life. She thought about the men she had served with, the ones who had not come home, the ones whose names she carried like stones in her chest. She thought about her husband Thomas, who had died in a training accident that she still blamed herself for, even after all these years. She thought about the day she had left the service, the day she had changed her name and moved to a small town and become Margaret Collins, a retired nurse, a grandmother, a woman who asked for nothing and expected nothing. She thought about all the mornings she had woken up in that other life, all the nights she had spent lying awake thinking about the things she could never tell anyone, all the moments she had chosen silence over revelation because she did not want to be seen, did not want to be thanked, did not want to relive the past that she had worked so hard to leave behind. She had been a ghost for so long. She had been invisible for so long. And now, in this quiet hospital room, with her grandson sleeping beside her and the weight of the day finally settling into her bones, she was beginning to understand that maybe being a ghost was not the same as being forgotten. Maybe invisibility was not the same as irrelevance. Maybe the past, even when it was buried, never really died. It just waited, patient and silent, until the moment arrived when it needed to come back. Thank you for watching this story. Thank you for giving your time and attention to a woman who spent her life protecting people who would never know her name. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and check out our other stories of military heroes and unsung veterans. Leave a comment below telling me about the veteran in your life. Share this video with your friends and family. And if you are able, please consider supporting our work on Patreon or Ko-Fi. Every bit of support helps us continue to tell these important stories. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and never forget the sacrifices that our veterans have made for all of us.